The rain had been falling steadily since early evening, drumming against the windshield of Daniel's old sedan as he navigated the winding country road. The wipers worked overtime, smearing the water in a hypnotic rhythm, and the beam of his headlights barely pierced the curtain of rain ahead. The GPS signal had cut out nearly 30 minutes ago, leaving him dependent on fading road signs and his memory. Every so often, a flash of lightning illuminated the landscape, revealing skeletal trees swaying violently in the wind, their branches clawing at the black sky. The sense of isolation pressed heavily on him. No other cars, no houses, just endless road and the low growl of thunder. As the minutes passed, Daniel's unease grew. His phone's battery had slipped into the red, and the eerie quiet between the bursts of thunder only made him more aware of his own breathing. Then, out of the darkness, his headlights caught a figure standing on the shoulder of the road. A lone man, drenched from head to toe, wearing what looked like an old, tattered trench coat. He didn't move to flag Daniel down. He simply stood there, his head tilted slightly downward, as if he were listening to something deep beneath the sound of the rain. Instinct screamed at Daniel to keep driving, but the idea of leaving someone stranded in this weather gnawed at his conscience. He slowed the car to a cautious stop and rolled the window down just enough for his voice to carry over the roar of the storm. "You need a ride?" Daniel called, his words almost swallowed by the wind. The man lifted his head slightly, revealing pale skin, water streaming from his slick back hair, and eyes that seemed too dark to reflect the light. "Yes," the stranger said, his voice low but clear, as if unaffected by the wind or the rain. Without waiting for an invitation, he opened the passenger door and slid in, the smell of wet earth and something faintly metallic following him inside. The car suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. They drove in silence for several minutes, the rain hammering the roof like nails. Daniel tried to make small talk, asking where the man was headed, but his passenger only gave short, vague answers. "Just further down," he would say, pointing vaguely toward the darkness ahead. Each time lightning flashed, Daniel caught glimpses of the man's hands resting on his knees, unnaturally still, with long, pale fingers that didn't seem to twitch even once. The stranger didn't shiver, didn't adjust his coat, didn't do anything but stare ahead, unblinking, as though he were watching something Daniel couldn't see. It wasn't until Daniel glanced at the rearview mirror that the first real shock hit him. In the faint light of the dashboard, the man's reflection wasn't there. The empty passenger seat stared back at him in the mirror, even though the weight in the seat beside him was unmistakable. His heart lurched, and he gripped the steering wheel tighter. Lightning flashed again, blinding him for a split second, and when his vision cleared, the man had turned his head, not toward Daniel, but toward the back seat, as if listening for someone who wasn't there.
Daniel hesitated in the doorway, his shoes sinking slightly into the damp rug that stretched across the entryway. The house was warmer than the storm outside, but the warmth wasn't comforting. It was stifling, thick, and almost too still. His ears rang faintly, as though the moment he'd crossed the threshold, the storm had muted completely. He turned instinctively, expecting to still hear the howl of wind and rain, but all he saw was the blur of water streaking down the window panes. Beyond that, silence. It was as though he had stepped out of one world and into another. The hallway stretched farther than he expected. Its walls were lined with faded wallpaper, once patterned with vines and flowers but now peeling in long strips. A grandfather clock leaned crookedly against one wall, its pendulum swaying though no ticking sound came from it. Further down, he spotted an arched doorway leading into what looked like a living room, faint firelight flickering against the wall. Still, no one had answered his call. No footsteps, no creak of floorboards, nothing to indicate the house was occupied, except for the undeniable glow of lights and fire. "Hello?" he tried again, his voice catching slightly in his throat. "I'm sorry to intrude, my car ran low on gas. I just need directions, maybe a phone if you have one." His words carried oddly, the echo trailing too long, as if bouncing through a space much larger than the hallway suggested. He frowned, his unease growing, but necessity drove him deeper inside. His phone had long since died, and he couldn't afford to wait out the storm in the car. Stepping into the living room, Daniel froze. The fire was lit, but the logs weren't burning. They glowed faintly, as though the light was trapped inside them, pulsing softly. The furniture looked as though it had been preserved for decades: heavy wooden chairs, a velvet sofa with stuffing poking from its seams, and a coffee table coated in dust thick enough to smear with a fingertip. On the mantel above the fire stood a collection of photographs in tarnished frames. He leaned closer, squinting through the dim light. Each photo showed a family posed stiffly in front of the very same house. Generations, it seemed, faces repeating eerily, as though the same people had lived here again and again, wearing slightly different clothes but with the same unchanging expressions. A creak came from behind him, sharp enough to make him whirl around. The hallway was empty, though he could have sworn he saw movement, a shadow, a shift, something slipping just out of sight. His heart thudded painfully as the air grew colder once more. For the first time since arriving, Daniel wondered if he had made a mistake stepping inside at all. Yet when he glanced back at the open door, it was no longer open. The wooden frame was shut tight, though he knew he hadn't touched it.
Daniel's pulse quickened, each beat thudding in his ears louder than the rain outside. He dared not look again into the rearview mirror, afraid the emptiness would still be there. The stranger sat unnervingly still, his head tilted just enough to suggest he was listening to something inside the car that Daniel couldn't hear. The wipers scraped across the windshield with a mechanical groan, the only sound filling the silence between them. Lightning lit up the road again, but this time, it illuminated something in the back seat for the briefest of moments, a faint silhouette, like someone leaning forward, though no one was there when the darkness returned. Trying to steady his voice, Daniel asked, "So, how far exactly do you need to go?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he slowly turned his gaze toward Daniel, his lips curling into the smallest trace of a smile. "Not far," he said finally, his tone carrying a weight that made Daniel's skin crawl. "Just to the bend ahead, and then you can turn around." The words hung in the air like a warning rather than a request. Daniel's hands tightened on the wheel, and for the first time that night, he considered pressing harder on the gas, just to get it over with. The road ahead narrowed, the overhanging branches forming a canopy that blotted out even the faintest glimmer of moonlight. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof so loudly it felt like being buried under water. Then, without warning, the man leaned forward slightly, his head angling toward the windshield as if focusing on something far down the road. "There," he whispered. Daniel followed his gaze but saw nothing, just blackness broken by the occasional flash of lightning. But then, he realized the lightning had stopped. No flashes. No rumble of thunder. Only the sound of rain and the faint hiss of the tires on wet pavement. The quiet became unbearable. Daniel's breathing grew shallow, his grip on the steering wheel slippery with sweat. He risked another glance at the rearview mirror. This time, there was something in the reflection, but it wasn't the man. The back seat was filled with shapes, shadowy figures hunched together, their heads jerking in tiny, unnatural movements, as if twitching to an unheard rhythm. Their outlines were indistinct, like smoke trapped in the shape of people, but their faces, or what should have been faces, were just dark hollows. His eyes darted back to the passenger seat. The man was staring at him now, his expression calm, almost satisfied. "You've brought us closer," the stranger said softly. Daniel's heart hammered against his ribs. "Closer to what?" he managed to choke out. The man's grin widened slightly, though his eyes remained cold and dead. "Closer to where we belong." As they reached the bend in the road, the stranger slowly turned his head toward the back seat again, and Daniel swore he heard faint whispers now, dozens of voices murmuring in a language he couldn't understand, growing louder with each passing second.
Daniel lingered in the dining room, his body stiff with indecision. Every instinct screamed for him to leave, but the sealed front door left no escape. The storm still raged outside, visible through the narrow windows, yet he could hear none of it, not a drop of rain, not a whisper of wind. It was like the house had swallowed the storm whole, cocooning him in its heavy silence. He forced himself to turn away from the table, moving carefully, as though sudden movement might provoke something unseen. His footsteps seemed louder now, echoing in unnatural rhythm, each step chased by another faint one, always a fraction behind. The hallway beyond the dining room was darker than before, the amber glow dimming as though the light was retreating deeper into the house. He reached into his pocket for his phone, forgetting it had long since died. Still, his thumb pressed against the blank screen, desperate for even the smallest light. At the far end of the hall, a door creaked open with agonizing slowness. Daniel froze. He hadn't touched it. The door swayed, then stopped, yawning wide enough to reveal a sliver of blackness beyond. For a long moment, Daniel did nothing. His breathing was shallow, ears straining. Then he heard it, soft, deliberate footsteps from the room beyond the open door. They were slow, steady, approaching. His skin prickled with dread, and he pressed himself back against the wall, eyes locked on the darkness. The footsteps paused just beyond the threshold. Silence followed. Then, with an awful certainty, Daniel realized someone, or something, was standing there, hidden by the darkness, watching him. He swallowed hard, voice trembling. "Who's there?" His words seemed to dissolve before reaching the open doorway. There was no reply, only the faint sound of breathing. Not his, this was deeper, slower, almost inhuman in its rhythm. He could feel it vibrating faintly in the air, a presence pressing against him like invisible weight. He wanted to run, but his legs refused to move. Instead, he squeezed his eyes shut for a single heartbeat, praying it was all in his imagination. When he opened them again, the door was shut tight once more, no sign of the figure, but the house had changed. The wallpaper seemed darker, curling at the edges as if scorched. The grandfather clock in the hallway had shifted upright, pendulum swinging, though no ticking sound followed. Daniel staggered backward, his chest heaving. He realized then with bone-deep certainty, the house wasn't empty. It had never been empty. It was alive, and it was aware of him. Daniel backed away from the hallway, his chest tightening with every breath. He needed to find another way out, kitchen doors, back exits, anything that could free him from the suffocating walls. He stumbled through another archway, finding himself in what looked like a study. The room smelled faintly of mildew and damp wood. Shelves sagged under the weight of rotting books, their spines cracked and titles faded. A desk sat against the far wall beneath a tall window streaked with rain. He rushed toward it, desperate for any sign of escape. The window was large, its glass warped from decades of weather. Outside, he could see the storm raging, trees swaying violently in the wind. Relief surged in him for a brief second. It proved the world outside still existed, still moved. He grabbed the latch and tugged hard, but it was stuck fast. He shoved harder, rattling the frame, but the glass barely quivered. Frustrated, he pressed his forehead against the pane, breath fogging the cold surface. That was when he saw it, reflected in the warped glass beside his own face was another. A pale figure loomed just behind him, its features distorted yet horribly clear. Hollow eyes stared back, wide and unblinking, and its mouth hung slightly open as though caught in a silent scream. Daniel's heart nearly stopped. He spun around so fast he crashed into the desk, sending a stack of papers fluttering to the floor. The room behind him was empty. He pressed himself against the wall, his breaths ragged, sweat dampening his palms despite the chill. His eyes darted to every shadow, every corner, expecting the figure to emerge. Nothing moved. The silence pressed heavier, suffocating. Slowly, he looked back to the window. The reflection was gone, but the faint impression of fingertips smeared against the inside of the glass remained, as though something had touched it from within the room. Daniel's resolve broke. He no longer cared about explanations, or the possibility of being rude to strangers. He had to get out, no matter what. He bolted from the study, his footsteps pounding down the hallway. But even as he ran, he could hear it again, the faint echo of another set of footsteps following, never too close, never too far, always keeping pace. Daniel's sprint carried him down the hallway, but every turn only seemed to lead him further into the house instead of closer to an exit. He passed door after door, some locked, others leading into rooms that seemed impossibly large compared to the house's exterior. His lungs burned, but the footsteps behind him never faltered, always keeping pace, steady and deliberate. It was no longer an echo. Something was following him. He ducked into a narrow corridor, its ceiling lower than the rest, plaster crumbling in jagged cracks. At the far end, he spotted what looked like another door leading outside. Hope surged, and he lunged forward, slamming his shoulder into it. The wood splintered, but when it swung open, he froze. Instead of the stormy night, the door revealed another hallway, longer, darker, lined with crooked picture frames. The door slammed shut behind him before he could turn back, the sound reverberating like a gunshot. Daniel's panic twisted into fury. "What do you want from me?" he shouted into the suffocating dark. His voice cracked but carried through the hall, bouncing back in distorted echoes. For a heartbeat, silence answered. Then, faintly, a whisper threaded through the air, not from ahead or behind, but from all around him at once. The words were indistinguishable, but the tone was unmistakable, mocking, cruel, amused. His skin crawled as though unseen fingers had brushed across his shoulders. The crooked frames on the wall drew his eye. Each one held a photograph, but they weren't the stiff family portraits he'd seen earlier. These were blurred, smeared, as if captured in motion. The more he looked, the more he realized they weren't strangers at all. They were of him. His face twisted in fear, caught mid-step, always from angles he hadn't noticed before, peeking through the study door, pausing in the dining room, standing at the hallway's end. Someone, or something, had been watching him since he arrived, recording every moment. His stomach lurched. He tore one of the frames from the wall, glass shattering at his feet. Behind it wasn't plaster, but darkness, an empty void stretching inward, deeper than the house's walls should allow. A cold wind whispered from it, carrying the faintest echo of his own panicked voice. He stumbled back, dropping the frame, as the whisper grew louder, layering over itself until it sounded like a chorus. All of them were his voice, pleading, screaming, calling for help. Daniel staggered backward from the broken frame, his pulse hammering in his throat. The chorus of voices grew louder, overlapping until they dissolved into a distorted roar. His own terrified face stared back at him from the other photographs along the hallway, dozens of frozen reflections. He clutched at the wall, fighting to steady himself, when the void behind the shattered frame began to shift. The blackness rippled, like water disturbed by a stone. At first, it was only an impression, a darker shadow forming in the endless dark. Then, piece by piece, it began to take shape. A hand emerged first, pale and skeletal, fingers too long, nails blackened and sharp. It gripped the edge of the broken frame, pulling forward with a strength that made the wood groan. The rest followed, a shoulder, a hollow face, skin stretched tight as parchment. Its eyes glowed faintly, not with light, but with an emptiness that made Daniel's stomach twist. He stumbled backward, colliding with the opposite wall. The figure dragged itself through the broken frame with an awful, deliberate slowness, its movements jerky, as though it had to fight against the barrier of reality itself. With each inch it gained, the air grew colder, and the whispers cut off into suffocating silence. Only the creak of its joints and the scrape of its nails on wood remained. Daniel could barely breathe. He wanted to run, but the hallway had shrunk around him, narrower, darker, the doors sealed tight. The house wanted him here. It wanted him to watch. The creature finally pulled free, standing hunched in the corridor. Its head tilted unnaturally to one side, as though studying him. Then, slowly, its mouth opened, wider and wider, until the skin at its jaw cracked. From its throat came a sound not its own, but his, Daniel's own voice screaming, echoing the very cry he had made moments ago. The mimicry was exact, down to the tremor of fear. His legs nearly gave out beneath him. For the first time since entering the house, Daniel broke into raw, desperate pleading. "Please, please, I don't belong here." His voice shook, but the figure only stepped closer, dragging one long nail along the wall, leaving behind a deep gouge. The photographs rattled in their frames, dust sifting down from the ceiling. The air pressed against him, urging him back, hurting him deeper into the house. And though every fiber of him resisted, Daniel realized he was no longer in control of his path. The house was guiding him toward something, toward the heart of whatever lived here. The creature lurched forward, its long nails scraping deep into the wall as it moved with a jerking, unnatural gait. Daniel didn't think, he ran. His shoes pounded against the warped floorboards, each step echoing with the hollow weight of desperation. Behind him, the figure gave chase, its motions erratic yet terrifyingly fast. The sound of its claws tearing wood was constant, like knives dragging across bone. He darted through a door at random, slamming it shut behind him. For a heartbeat, the silence returned, and he allowed himself a trembling breath. But then the wood beneath his hands pulsed faintly, as though alive. A crack splintered across the panel, and a pale hand burst through, fingers clawing wildly at the air. Daniel screamed and stumbled backward, tripping over a chair and crashing to the floor. He scrambled to his feet and bolted through another doorway before the creature could force its way in. The house warped as he ran. Hallways stretched impossibly long, staircases twisted upward only to dead end at blank walls, and doors opened to the same rooms he'd already fled. His breath tore at his lungs, sweat and rain mingling on his skin. No matter which way he turned, the figure was always there, emerging from shadows, dragging itself from walls, stepping out of doorways he had just closed. It was as though the house itself was folding space to ensure he could never truly escape. At one point, he stumbled into what looked like a child's bedroom. The wallpaper was faded with cartoon animals, their eyes scratched out with something sharp. A crib sat in the corner, its mattress blackened and charred. He didn't want to look closer, but as he backed toward the opposite door, the crib rattled violently, wood creaking under invisible weight. A sharp cry pierced the silence, not a baby's cry, but his own, the exact sound of his voice moments earlier when he had shouted in terror. He covered his ears and fled, slamming the door so hard the frame cracked. The chase drove him downward at last, into a steep, spiraling staircase he hadn't noticed before. The air grew damp and heavy, carrying the smell of rotten earth. His footsteps echoed into the depths as he descended, the figure's relentless pursuit always close behind. When he finally burst into the basement, the last light from above winked out, leaving him in near total darkness. The only sound was his own ragged breathing, until, slowly, he realized the breathing wasn't his alone anymore. The basement was colder than the storm outside, the air damp and heavy, reeking of mold and something far worse, rotting flesh masked by earth. Daniel pressed his back against the wall, eyes straining against the near-total dark. His hands trembled as he fumbled along the stone, searching for anything, light switch, candle, something, but the walls were bare, clammy to the touch. The breathing he had heard earlier hadn't stopped. It seemed to circle him, rising and falling, coming from everywhere at once. Then, faintly, a glow appeared in the distance. A sickly amber light flickered through the dark, pulsing like the embers in the strange fireplace upstairs. Daniel moved toward it, drawn despite his fear. As his eyes adjusted, he realized the light was coming from lanterns mounted along the basement walls. But they weren't fueled by fire. The glass globes glowed from within, each one holding something inside, objects floating in a thick, murky fluid. He stepped closer, and his stomach lurched. They weren't objects. They were faces. Each lantern contained a human head, distorted by the liquid, eyes open and staring, mouths twisted in silent screams. Daniel staggered back, bile rising in his throat. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, lining the stone walls of the basement like trophies. Some were old, flesh sloughed away until only bone remained, while others looked fresh, eyes still glistening with horror. His legs nearly gave out beneath him as he realized the awful truth. These were the house's prisoners, those who had stepped inside before him. The whispers returned, swelling into a deafening chorus. He pressed his hands over his ears, but it did nothing. The voices weren't around him, they were inside him. Each lantern vibrated with sound, the dead speaking in fractured murmurs. Some begged. Some warned. Others laughed, a hollow, hopeless sound that turned his blood to ice. He stumbled forward, desperate to escape, but the floor seemed to slope downward, leading him deeper into the chamber. At the far end of the basement, he saw it, a massive structure rising out of the stone. It looked like a furnace, though no fire burned within it. Instead, the same pulsating amber light leaked through its iron seams, as if something alive was trapped inside. The whispers grew louder, twisting into words at last. His name. Over and over, spoken in dozens of voices, each one a perfect mimic of his own. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The house didn't just trap people. It consumed them, their voices, their faces, their very identities. And now it wanted his. Daniel's legs shook as he stumbled toward the furnace, his name echoing in 1,000 overlapping voices. The amber light leaking through the iron seams pulsed faster now, as though responding to his presence, drawing him closer with invisible hands. He pressed against the wall, trying to resist, but his body betrayed him. Every step felt guided, pulled by something stronger than his will. The whispers weren't only around him anymore, they were inside his chest, vibrating through his ribs, commanding him forward. The furnace groaned as he approached, its iron face shifting. For a moment, Daniel thought he saw shapes pressing against the seams from within, hands, faces, whole bodies writhing in the glow, desperate to escape. Their features twisted in anguish before sinking back into the light. He screamed, the sound tearing his throat raw, but the house swallowed his cry like it had swallowed the storm outside. His voice joined the chorus instantly, echoing back at him, mocking, multiplying that he fell to his knees before the furnace, clutching his head. Please, I don't want this, I don't belong here. But the voices answered in perfect unison, you do now. The furnace doors creaked open slowly, releasing a blinding rush of amber light that poured over him. It wasn't warm. It was cold, so cold it burned, searing his skin and hollowing him out from within. Daniel tried to crawl away, but his hands slipped on the damp stone. Shadows stretched long across the basement, wrapping around his limbs, pulling him forward. The last thing Daniel saw was his own reflection in the glowing metal, his face, but wrong. Hollow eyes stared back, skin pale and stretched tight, mouth gaping in silent scream. He tried to fight, but the furnace drew him in with relentless force. His body dissolved into the light, his voice swallowed into the chorus, another echo lost among the countless souls that had come before. The doors slammed shut with a deafening clang, and the basement fell silent once more. Upstairs, the house exhaled. The fire in the parlor flared, the lanterns on the walls dimmed, and the storm outside suddenly resumed, as though nothing had ever been amiss. The Victorian home stood quiet and patient at the edge of town, its porch light burning steady through the rain. It waited, as it always had, for the next traveler who would lose their way.